and good afternoon to those joining us from further afield. Welcome to the Gulf International Forum panel today on the most pressing issue for all of us, I believe, the ceasefire and negotiations in the war between the United States and Israel with Iran, and the effect on energy lifelines and the risk of escalation. We are here to discuss what is rapidly becoming one of the most consequential developments for the global economy: the impact of the current U.S. Israeli confrontation with Iran and its spillover into Lebanon on the world's energy lifelines, and the very real risk that the situation could escalate beyond control. I spent much of last night and early this morning trying to assemble a coherent picture of where things stand, and more importantly, where they may be heading over the next few hours and days. The honest answer, unfortunately, is that the situation remains fluid and unclear. So let me put this out in as neutral a way as possible. What we do know is this: after several weeks of sustained conflict, Pakistan, reportedly with at least tacit Chinese backing, has stepped forward to mediate a ceasefire between the United States and Iran. According to statements out of Islamabad, the terms are relatively straightforward: a pause on hostilities, a reopening of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and a limited window on the order of 2 weeks for negotiations toward a more durable arrangement. Pakistan has asserted that this ceasefire is intended to apply broadly across the region. However, that interpretation is not universally shared. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has signaled acceptance, unwillingly, of a ceasefire with Iran, but has made it equally clear that Israel intends to continue its operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. As of very recently, Israeli air operations in Lebanon are ongoing, and there are indications, though this depends on remains unclear, depends on where you're listening, that Iran has not fully normalized passage through the Strait of Hormuz. In short, we are looking at a situation in which a ceasefire may exist on paper, but not yet fully in practice, and where the energy implications hinge not only on what has been agreed, but what is actually going on the ground. I regret not being able to offer a more definitive picture. Fortunately, we have assembled an outstanding panel of experienced practitioners, diplomatic, strategic, and economic, who are far better positioned than I and are here to help us understand both where this is going and what it may mean for global energy markets. In order of appearance, Ms. Jennifer Gavito is a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative within the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. Gavito is a senior advisor at the Cohen Group, where she co-leads the firm's Middle East practice. She was most recently a career Foreign Service officer with the rank of Minister Counselor. Gavito has more than 25 years of experience working in diplomatic positions in Washington and throughout the Middle East and Europe, on the staff of the National Security Council, and is senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense. Colby is Energy Intelligence's head of Middle East content and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Based in Dubai, Mr. Connelly leads development of editorial and research efforts that cover the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Arman Mahmoudian is a research fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. He's also a lecturer of international affairs at the University of South Florida and a member of the editorial board at the Joint Special Operations University. Let's begin. Jen Gavito, in your opinion, what factors motivated the U.S. administration to pursue or accept a ceasefire, and how does this align with the broader regional priorities with allies in the Gulf and Israel?
Well, an easy question to start the day with. Thanks so much for having me. I think to first answer that question, you have to go back to the origins of the conflict. And I guess, frame a bit what it was that President Trump and certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu were seeking. And as has been well documented at this point, the answer to that question is frustratingly vague. We have heard justifications ranging from degradation of what was allegedly already an obliterated nuclear program, to protection of Iranian civilians, to dismantlement of Iran's military, to complete regime change. By not having a clear set of objectives to start this operation, I think it became increasingly difficult, excuse me, increasingly difficult for President Trump to define what an off ramp could look like. And although we heard reassurances throughout those initial weeks that an off ramp and plan were firmly in place, I think we can all understand at this point that that was not true. And so when the administration over the past couple of weeks began to understand that the Iranian regime was more resilient than it had understood, and I think this is a good moment to remind people that a lot of the expertise that existed within the US government up until last year had been largely dismantled, leaving in place very few people that had significant understanding of the regime or having worked previous rounds of negotiations. And so there had been a lot of misunderstanding, I think, within the government, within our government, as to what the regime could withhold. And of course, for the Iranian regime, simply surviving was in and of itself a significant achievement. And so I think it became increasingly frustrating for President Trump to understand that regime change first was not an option. Protection of the Iranian people very quickly went off the table, especially as strikes on civilian targets increased. And certainly with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, his entire second term economic agenda, which was based not just on broad economic prosperity, but specifically on partnership economically with the Gulf countries, looking back to the $1.4 trillion in deals that he signed during his first overseas trip back in May, all of that came into risk. And so I think what we were seeing over the last couple of weeks was a scramble to figure out, could you end the conflict militarily? The assessment very clearly became you could not. And so there needed to be an off-ramp found. My understanding is that when the Pakistanis came with a proposal, the administration was inclined to accept it and therefore tried to mold it and publicly position it in a way that sounded as if U.S. strategic objectives had been met. We can talk about that in the next round. I think what we see at this point is a situation where certainly the U.S. has had significant military and tactical successes. But if you go back to the start of what strategic success may look like, I think fundamentally we're in a more difficult position today, despite a ceasefire, than we were a month ago before the Strait of Hormuz was closed. And so, when you talk about a tenuous situation, I think you're absolutely right in that if we can't get the strait reopened, then the objectives for the ceasefire itself will not have been met. You've got the nuclear question still looming. And of course, you've got the significant strikes yesterday from Israel on Lebanon that the Iranian regime is calling a red line. So all of this presents a situation where the objectives for the administration, perhaps going into the ceasefire, were understood as a moment of significant concern about where the conflict was headed, but whether those objectives can be achieved through where the ceasefire stands today, I think is a looming question.
Keeping up my line about confusion reigns. Going on, Arman Mahmoudian, what key pressures or incentives led the Iranian leadership to agree to a ceasefire at this stage of the conflict?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And second, I think it's a combination of the scale of the attacks, the expansion of the scale attacks, and also probably a bit change of discourse or dynamic in Iranian leadership. If I want to go one by one, well, the Islamic Republic has it shows has a great deal of capacity to absorb pain. It shows that it can survive decapitation. And to be honest, this is not the first time that Iran faces decapitation. The first time that actually Iran faced decapitation was about a year and a half right after the revolution. When you go through 1979 to 1981, you would notice that about 2/3 of the the giant figure of the Islamic Revolution, like Mohonar, Beheshti, Talaqani, Rajai, they all get assassinated or die, but they survive it. So this was the second time. But aside the decapitation and the infliction of the pain on Iranian military infrastructure, in the recent days of the war, recent weeks of the war, we have seen a constant, deliberate, and growing attacks against the Iranian non-military infrastructure. Some made an argument that those non-military or civilian infrastructure, such as the steel production, were still at the service of the Iran's military. That's a different debate. It can be valid, but I don't want to get into it. But I want to focus on the civilian infrastructure itself. For instance, let's say that the attack on Iran is steel production. Well, according to the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, the attack halted it or even destroyed the capacity of Iran for about 70% of Iran's capacity for producing steel. If it is true, which means Iran is out of the 35 million tons of the steel that used to produce, now is about at the range of about 13 million, and has lost its capacity to produce about 22 million tons of the steel. They say in order to build manufacturing and industrial capacity, which is capable of producing about 800 million tons of the steel, you need to spend something between $700 to $800 million. So the attack itself on the steel production will cost Iran, in order to recover, something around the $20 billion. And then there have been other attacks similarly on the same bridges, on the pharmaceutical companies. And prior to the war, there was also threat of the President Trump that there will be an attack on nuclear planets, or as he put it, the nuclear planet day. And also some hints on the water, destination. These would take the Islamic Republic billions and billions of the dollars to rebuild. Wouldn't necessarily lead in to result in a collapse of the regime. Regime shows itself at this good at one thing, and it's surviving, but it would cost the Islamic Republic governing over the country very difficult for years and years to come. So that's, I think, one part of it. The other part that I think it has changed, I think there was also a change of discourse inside the Iranian leadership. That change of the discourse could have been by the pressure from the friends, like the Pakistanis, even to some extent Chinese and Indians, and also probably a growth in the rule of the Mojtaba Khamenei. And I'm saying that based on the report that the Axios made yesterday. Axios made a report yesterday, and in which Barak Ravid claims that at the last minute, what changed Tehran's mindset regarding the ceasefire, it was Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader as of March 8, deliberately approving the ceasefire and pushing, sending a signal he wants the war to be ceased, at least for temporary. And that kind of ended it, according to that report, dispute or disagreements, among the different faction of the Islamic Republic. If this is true, which Axios relatively has been a very credible source, it shows that the Mojtaba Khamenei is growingly getting more and more involved into the decision making. Specifically, speaking, compared to the early days of the war, which we don't have much of information about his whereabouts. We don't know to what extent he was healthy or functional. And his emergence would require, for his own sake, in order to maintain the leadership over the country, to want this war to be at least temporarily ceased. And these are, I guess, the purposes and the incentives of Iran.
Thank you very much. One question that has arisen while I was sort of searching for information on what to say this morning. Do you believe that the leadership has become more diverse, or is it still highly centralized under the supreme leader? Presumably when the Israelis tried to decapitate, they also blew up the offices these people were in and blew up some of the communications. How much information do we have that the leadership is still in control of all the different parts of the government?
Is the question directed at me? Or for Colby?
Yeah.
I think the leadership is still in charge of country overall. First of all, we haven't seen any evidence that shows that until they are losing control, even in the neighboring area like Balochistan, Gaza, Khuzestan, and Kurdistan. And more importantly, look at the war. Look, the war throughout the wartime, Iran has a relatively same tempo of the behavior, and then they decide toward the end of the war, the day of the ceasefire, to end the war. Yes, this is true. The first couple of the hours after the civil war, there were still the missiles and drones being launched from Iran. But historically, in every single ceasefire, the first few hours are like that. So we have a government that was capable of maintaining the war with the same strategy. We can make an argument that the strategy was valid or wasn't, and also ended the war, at least accepted the war decisively and enforced it within few hours. These requires a centralized decision making. They may have autonomy, given autonomy to the IRGC leaders, specifically speaking to provisional ones, but this requires a centralized government. In addition to that, one of the other signs that it shows to me, at least, that still there's a government intact there despite all of the decapitation, is that we have witnessed no defection. And that's very important because defections usually happens in one of these two scenarios. The first scenario is that the troops, the officers, they are afraid of their life for any variety of the reason. The second reason is that the people in the government, they defect because the government from itself has collapsed. So there is no one to give order, there's no one to rely on, there is no one to look up to. So in the event of Iran, we haven't seen any defection. And more importantly, one of the things that I believe it deserves attention is that throughout the war, President Trump asked for the defection and invited the Iranian officials 3 times. The last time that he made that request, he broadened his request. He actually asked the Iranian diplomats also to defect. And technically speaking, that for the diplomats are the easiest to defect because they are already abroad. And we haven't seen that either. We haven't seen any defection from any meaningful, Iranian diplomat. If we all take this together, I would say the Islamic Republic, its decision-making system, if it is compared to a body, it might have lost a leg, it might be badly injured, it still is functional, still is alive.
Okay, thank you very much. Going on, Mr. Connelly, what specific political or military factors on the Iranian side could determine whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open, restricted, or escalates into some sort of checkpoint crisis?
Thanks, Ambassador, and thank you to the GIF for having me. It's great to be with you. Yeah, I'd say that we're already in a choke point crisis. That's what gives Iran the level of leverage that it has in the current situation. I think, depending on how things go in Islamabad, the question is whether or not some form of compromise that allows Iran to feel that it retains some leverage over the strait can be reached. I don't think at the current point that we're at that anyone really knows what that looks like. But I think with Iran looking for some form of reassurance that a conflict doesn't start up again, I think the kind of newfound control and leverage that it has with the strait is something that it's going to view as an insurance policy, and it's not going to want to just trade that in any negotiation without any kind of concession coming at a very, very high price. Now the kind of sticking point that everyone was trying to figure out yesterday when this was first announced was whether or not Iran was going to try and impose some form of a toll for shipping going through the strait, which is a difficult thing to do. Tolls only really take place at man-made canals like the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. The strait is a naturally occurring waterway, so it's a different situation altogether, and it's also shared by the territorial waters of Oman, and Oman has said that it has no intention of charging a toll. One of the points that Iran had looked for in order to at least presumably make some kind of progress in negotiations is some form of reparations for the damage that's been done to a lot of its infrastructure during the conflict so far. And I guess the question that has to be asked in that regard is, is that part of what the tolling arrangement was aimed to satisfy? And if tolling is a non-starter, which I think it's safe to assume it probably will be with the U.S., can sanctions relief constitute some form of reparations, or will that be enough? I'd say it's also probably doubtful, but it is worth considering that Iran is really the only country that can more or less export from the Gulf at capacity right now, or at least something close to it. Before the conflict started, their oil exports were running at roughly 1.5 million barrels per day. It's declined somewhat since then. But in terms of getting production up and running again, there is a much longer runway for the rest of the Gulf to have to get through in order for things to get moving again, particularly for the countries that have been more or less shut in, like Kuwait and Iraq. Iran actually really doesn't have that obstacle right now. There have been plenty of components of their oil and gas sector's infrastructure that have been damaged. But by and large, it hasn't, to the extent that anyone can tell, taken massive amounts of their production offline. So I think it really any kind of new arrangement around the status of the strait and how that is perceived during the talks, and whether or not, again, any kind of compromise can be reached in that regard, is going to be a huge point moving forward on this. It's something that is going to raise a lot of alarm in the Gulf for sure, because prior to the conflict, there were no efforts to impose any kind of restriction on the flow of maritime traffic like this before. I think it's, even if there is some form of a compromise reached, say it's a best case scenario, and there is some kind of agreement, I don't think a lot of the Gulf states will see that as the total end game in terms of their ability to keep their exports flowing through the strait. I think there will be, in some ways, more work to be done in that regard.
Quick question. While researching for this morning, I came across a couple of news accounts indicating that the ships that have gone through so far include bulk carriers, a container ship, but that no crude oil tankers have gone through yet. In your opinion, is this one accurate, two intentional, or just the luck of who was lined up first?
There could be some luck of who was lined up first, but I think that that the best point of leverage that Iran has right now is its ability to impose costs by restricting the flow of energy through the strait. So I don't think it's a coincidence that there haven't been any oil tankers or LNG carriers that have gone through at this point. I don't think there's any reason to expect that Iran would give that up before talks are underway. I mean, that would be an enormous concession before the negotiations have even started.
Okay, thank you. So it's even if unproven, it's likely. Going on, Ms. Gavito, looking ahead, what diplomatic, economic, or military tools can the U.S. deploy to maximize its leverage and shape the outcome of negotiations? I'm assuming this, and the assumption is that the U.S. does not break the ceasefire.
That is an assumption. It also assumes that we don't assume that Israel's breaking of the ceasefire is inherent in that question. So, I mean, first and foremost, the United States continues to possess significant military strength. And that I think we've seen again overnight through the president's trumps about shooting guns. Will continue to be a kind of a default for this administration as far as projecting power. But there are probably other tools that would be far more influential. First and foremost, I think, is the president's willingness to be flexible in some of the longstanding terms that the U.S. Has, seen as foundational to its foreign policy. One thing that has been consistent across both of the Trump administrations is a willingness to depart from a lot of long-held national security beliefs, whether that was moving the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords, speaking directly with Hamas at the end of the Gaza conflict. You can parse each of those as to the impact, but President Trump has shown that he is willing to take an unorthodox approach. And if you believe what I think is a truth, that this conflict cannot be won militarily, it has to be won diplomatically, that is actually quite a significant tool in his arrow in his quiver. Because it would allow for more flexibility in negotiating with the Iranian regime, a more long-term framework for peace. Even if the ceasefire stands at the moment with the terms that we understand to be shaping it, specifically a standoff over Iran's right to pursue nuclear enrichment, and the reality that whether it opens the strait fully in the coming days or not, it retains the ability to shut down global commerce whenever it chooses. If those things are assumed to be true, then I think that you are taking this ceasefire framework and setting up a situation where we have varying degrees of conflict renewed every 6 months or a year, similar to the trajectory that we've seen over this last year with first the 12-day war, which ostensibly obliterated Iran's nuclear program and now has led to greater conflict. Nothing that's on the table at the moment would resolve the issues between the United States and Iran permanently. So if this administration were willing to lay out a roadmap for Iran that addressed its sanctions relief requirements, took a creative approach, as the last administration tried, last Biden administration tried, to its nuclear program, et cetera, then maybe you can come up with a framework that is more sustainable over time. I don't know that we're there yet, and I don't know that the domestic political considerations in the United States would allow for such flexibility, but I would argue that it should at least be on the table, because otherwise we are going to find ourselves, as I said, back in renewed conflict every 6 months or a year otherwise. We've taken sanctions off the table, lifted some of them on Iran. Those can obviously be reimposed. That's always a tool, arguably not the most effective tool. But ultimately, one of the challenges for the Trump administration at the moment is it really does hold few cards. The Iranian regime is certainly weakened by the last 6 weeks of war. But at the end of the day, it has survived. It does continue to hold many of the cards. And so the administration is going to have to get creative if it wants to come up with a real solution to this.
Interesting. On the diplomatic side, the United States has made three demands, if you sort of try to sort this out. Demand number one is Iran stop all enrichment and give up anything it owns in the way of enriched uranium. Demand number two is eliminating or restricting its missile forces so that they cannot strike Israel. And number three tends to be, I forgot what number three was, but let's try of those two. Which is the United States most likely to not fold on, and which one do you think the United States could give away?
So I think the nuclear question is arguably the biggest. Strait of Hormuz aside, it was open a month ago. It's not now. That is a problem, arguably of our own creation. The nuclear issue is, I think, the one that is most concerning long term at the moment. And that is because you have replaced an Iranian leadership that had largely committed to not weaponizing its nuclear technology, to a more hardline regime that will almost certainly see weaponization as the only plausible way to restore deterrence. And so that is deeply problematic for the United States, for Israel, and for our Gulf allies. As such, I think there has to be a solution to that problem before this conflict can be claimed to be resolved. And we've not really seen any progress towards that at the moment. So I don't know that I think the U.S. I don't think the U.S. can fold on that. I think it can be creative. You can move enrichment out and have that stored, highly enriched uranium stored elsewhere. You can put limitations on what can be done with that. You can support the basis of a civilian nuclear program as part of a longer term roadmap. There are ways to address this issue, but simply walking away with it unaddressed, I don't think is possible. The missiles are a problem, and I think that we are going to see that unresolved because whatever strikes you make, and we've seen that to some degree even in the last weeks, they can be rebuilt. And so, I tend to agree with successive administrations in the United States that Iran is not the most reliable negotiating partner. I tend to think that it will, regardless of what it says in these negotiations, seek to rebuild its missile program. And I'm not sure there's a lot the U.S. will do about that.
The third one, I couldn't read my handwriting, was Iranian support, our demand that Iran stop all support to its various allies and proxies around the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, most of those have been degraded as it is. The United States, I think, as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran in the last administration, our policy was to reorient Iraq away from Iran. There are real ways to do that. Hezbollah is kind of the one remaining piece, and I do think that the actions that Israel is taking now against Lebanon actually undermine a legitimate Lebanese government attempt to rein in Hezbollah and address that problem long term. But I do think that overall we've seen a significant degradation of those proxy capabilities over the last 2 years.
Thank you. Mr. Mahmoudian, as negotiations hopefully start moving forward, what tools is Iran likely to use to maximize its strategic gains, whether through regional leverage, proxy networks, nuclear positioning, or what?
Well, that's a good question, and I think both Mr. Connelly and Ms. Gavito touched on it. The primary thing right now for Iran would be the Strait of the Hormuz, and also the remaining of its highly enriched uranium, the so-called 400 kilogram of the 60% enriched, and also it seems a large volume of that actually low level enriched. The rest of the things that Iran had or was planning to use them as a leverage, specifically speaking, its regional proxies. From what we can see right now, especially in the in the light of the events in the Lebanon and the impact it's making on the ceasefire and the sustainability of the ceasefire, it seems that those militias, while they were a leverage, a toolbox for Iran, a tool in Iran's toolbox during the wartime, but during the negotiations such as this, they actually can turn to be a liability. As we can see, the Hezbollah-Israelis clash can lead actually to the collapse of it. There has this potentiality to the collapse of the ceasefire. But what remains as Iran's main tool would be the Strait of the Hormuz, because Iranian understood very clearly that the Strait of the Hormuz is the point of pain for the United States. But more importantly, is a pressure point against the rest of the world. It can take the global economy relatively and to some extent, at least from the energy perspective, hostage. That can be a pressure over the Americans, which makes resolving the matter of the Strait of Hormuz quite hard. The second issue that the Iranians have over here is the remaining of the Iranian enriched uranium, how they want to reach it. They always can use it as a card, but both of these leverages comes like many other leverage with a limit. Specifically speaking, if you are the one who is in the negotiation, doesn't have the upper military hand, and that limit is that you are just can use them so much, and after a while, that very leverage turns to be the cause of the war. In the case of the uranium, is going to be lesser because so far Iran doesn't have much of a facility that can keep that uranium running or enrich it to a higher level, to neighborhood of 92% to create a bomb. There are arguments out there that Iran may be capable of the creating, or manufacturing the dirty bomb, but we haven't seen much of evidence in that Iran in past was interested in that. In a case of the Strait of the Hormuz, Iran also, it seems, has made a commitment to actually keep the strait open. At least some people make an argument. But as you mentioned, we still haven't seen this restoration or the normalization of the Strait of Hormuz in case of the crude oils and other matters. There's just so much that Iran can also pressure this. I think throughout these 2 weeks of the ceasefire, Iranians are not necessarily willing to let the Strait of the Hormuz be completely open. They are not necessarily interested in Norway, taking the business, making the business as usual in the strait. They would like it to be relatively open in order to, maintain the ceasefire and give the negotiation a chance. But also they want to impose some level of covert disruption, nothing physical and actual, but in order to still keep that leverage over the American hands and the other parties throughout this fire, because America has its military buildup is still in the region, and we have seen it yesterday from President Trump and the White House statements that they have no desire at this point to withdraw even a soldier from the region or even a missile from the region, and which makes sense because it is a ceasefire, and ceasefires historically speaking, 4 to 5 are collapsing. They are resulting in the restoration of the war. So I believe these two, the enrichment of the uranium and the Strait of the Hormuz, are the primary leverages that Iran has in conflict.
Okay. Mr. Connelly, you probably have the single most important and closing of the opening questions here. How is the ceasefire and ongoing negotiations shaping global energy markets, particularly in terms of price stability, supply security, and confidence in Gulf export routes? If you could also, I think this and the stock market are the two issues that probably most figure in Mr. Trump's calculations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just taking those in the order that you laid them out, in terms of price stability, there's a very limited near-term impact. Oil prices pulled back to around the $90 to $95 per barrel range when the ceasefire was announced. Now it is back. Brent crude is closer to $100 a barrel once again. The supply security angle is really the key point of the question, because in the current stage of the ceasefire we're in, it's done almost nothing. Now we're still early days, but in terms of getting oil and refined products and LNG flowing through the strait again, as you noted earlier, we're not there yet. And that's an important point of leverage for Iran to retain going into the talks. What it does do that I think, at least in the longer term, improves the supply security picture is hopefully brings the attacks on energy infrastructure to a halt for the time being. Yesterday did not look very promising in that regard, for sure. There were attacks on Fujairah here in the UAE. There was an attack on an Iranian refinery, in addition to the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, which is what has enabled Saudi Arabia to continue exporting oil via its West Coast export terminals on the Red Sea, and is right now basically the largest outlet for crude coming out of the region. Bringing that to a halt will hopefully improve the picture in the near term, and we'll have to see where things go from there. But in the interim, even if production is not ramping up, hopefully the damage caused by these kinds of attacks, of which there have been roughly 90 or so during the course of the war, can at least be limited. I can't speak for the other Gulf states that can stay here in the UAE. The Ministry of Defense reported that there were no missiles or drones fired at the UAE today in the last roughly 24-hour period, which is the first day that the numbers have been at zero since the war started. So it's still a bleak situation, but I think we'll take all the good news we can get for now. But in terms of where this goes with Gulf export routes, again, hopefully the lower tempo or the halt in attacks on infrastructure preserves the alternate routes that do exist for now. So that's the East-West pipeline that I mentioned before, and Fujairah on the Indian Ocean coast of the UAE. We at Energy Intelligence for the second quarter of the year see prices in the $90 per barrel range as a fair price, given the disruptions that markets have faced and the amount of time that if a lasting ceasefire or a halt to the war can be reached, there would still be a lot of time taken to restart production, get laden ships out of the Gulf, repair infrastructure, things like that. If things do resume, then we see this kind of upward trajectory in prices again. You've already seen demand destruction in a lot of economies in South and Southeast Asia, so that does at some point have some downward pressure on price, but that's not a good thing because that essentially represents a halt to economic activity. In the meantime, you will probably have these continued releases of oil from inventories. We don't think that ongoing releases will keep up with the scale of the supply disruption if it lasts. And the analogy that is kind of the favorite for that is that it's meeting demand out of inventories is like paying rent out of your 401k. You need production to return in order for more stability in the market to prevail, and just constantly drawing down inventories doesn't do that. So in short, it's a very, very limited impact in actually stabilizing the market for the time being.
Has the market or will the market price in the amount of damage that's been done to the production facilities? Let's assume that the strait opens up, that there's a relatively free movement of shipping through the strait. You still have a significant amount of damage has been done inside the straits to all the countries, including Iran's export facilities and production facilities. Will the market price that in? Well, what are some of the long-term or the medium-term consequences until they get things fixed? Is there export capacity elsewhere to make up for
it? In short, no, there really isn't. It takes time to ramp up capacity elsewhere. The markets have priced in some of the damage, particularly in LNG markets, given that a significant portion of global supply was taken out of commission, not just when Qatar Energy declared force majeure, but when 2 of its trains were damaged. That really took roughly 3% of global liquefaction capacity offline for a longer period of time. And it's a bit more of a question, I think, as to how long it takes to get those facilities repaired and producing again. But it has, I think, more of a limited impact. While a lot of the supply is inaccessible anyway, there have been a lot of refineries targeted. That is very consequential, particularly for how much more dependent Europe has become on Gulf refining capacity as they've tried to move away from Russian refined products in recent years. There's been a major ripple effect, particularly in jet fuel. If anyone's booking airline tickets anytime soon, you'll definitely notice that in the fare you're likely to pay. So that is getting priced in. But the longer this goes on, and as we've recently in the last week or so seen a lot of the cargoes that were the last out of the Gulf reach their final destinations, the physical tightness will materialize much quicker, and we'll only see an upward trajectory in prices from there.
Thank you. I have a question that I think about as we get into the questions and answers first, that would apply to each of the 3 separately. So I would like to put this question to each of you one at a time. Assuming that the easy or the most likely place that the ceasefire could fall apart would be a spillover or an acceleration of the war in Lebanon, of Israel's actions in Lebanon, and each of the Jen, how do you think the United States will act if it, assuming it wants the ceasefire to continue? How will it act towards Israel in this case? Arman, the same question in terms of what level of provocation will the Iranians sustain before they decide they have to get involved again in Lebanon? And Mr. Connelly, what is there outside in the way of putting some real pressure on, I mean, in the markets, on the economic side, putting some pressure on Israel to calm down in Lebanon? Jen.
Sure. It's a great question. In fact, I had intended to raise that in the initial question about what the United States has as far as leverage goes. Certainly, one of the greatest tools of leverage that the U.S. has is its leverage over the Israeli government, should it choose to exercise that. You say what could or what should the U.S. government do? I would argue that there is a difference between what it will do and what it should do. Um, Certainly, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is viewing this conflict as an opportunity to really pursue some Israeli national security objectives that have been long on the table. This conflict itself is something that he has been arguing for over 20 years. There is a point at which, and I think we've long passed it, where U.S. And Israeli national security interests diverge. And certainly in the case of Lebanon and potential spillover into Syria, potential spillover into Jordan, we see that divergence very clearly. And so whether or not President Trump is willing to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to end this operation and step back from what I think is probably a plan to at least in the medium term fully occupy Lebanon south of the Litani, it remains to be seen. But that would go a long way to not only protecting the current ceasefire, but at the same time towards restoring some semblance of stability through the larger region and ensuring that this conflict doesn't spiral out of control. The points of leverage with the Israeli government are well known. They rely very heavily on the United States for security funding as a starting point. We have rarely sought to leverage that, but that is a possibility. And again, the president is often unorthodox in his foreign policy, so I do think that that could be on the table.
Arman,
Well, that's a good.
Iran's pain point, I should say.
Well, regarding the Iran's threshold of the tolerance, I think Lebanon has all the potentials, the issue in Lebanon, to completely cause the collapse of the ceasefire. And there is just so much that the Iranian can, tolerate. Because the dilemma that Iranian have is kind of defeats the whole purpose of the forward policy that at the beginning they had. At the beginning of their so-called forward policy or axis of resistance, the argument that was that Iran will fund this militia and these militias will fight Iran's fight, or at least assist Iran to expand its influence. Throughout the October 2023, we will notice gradually Iran actually gets involved in their wars. Which brings us to the two-day issue of the Hezbollah. Iran has two options. One option is to completely remain inactive and basically doesn't do anything, condemns, pressures, but don't do anything. If it is the case, then Iranian will face a great deal of danger to lose their credibility before the eyes of the other militias, including the Hezbollah, because then Iran would appear as a political entity that at the end of the day, despite all the slogans regarding the resistance, the oppressed nations, and all, threw them under the bus. So you make a case that these militias are relatively, and not relatively, are highly depend on Iran's financial assistance, military assistance, but they at the end between the assistance and between survival, they will choose the survival. We are driven by our survivalist instinct. The other point is that Iran gets involved and basically ends the ceasefire. If Iran does the same, they does this, and Iran wants to end the ceasefire for the Hezbollah, then Iran would face a great deal of pressure in home, because then the Iranian people would ask that, look, we already got to this point for the foreign policy that you chose that doesn't necessarily make sense too much to us, beginning from the hostage crisis to this day. But now you are basically bringing country back to a total war, which for this war for Iran is a total war, for the sake of the Hezbollah, for the sake of the foreign nation, foreign country. So Iran has a very hard position to do. What extent or what would be the breaking point for the Iranian tolerance? I think if the Israeli makes the move to actually occupy the South Litani, or any major, at the progress of the war, to the extent that we are seeing Hezbollah to its knee, and we are facing Hezbollah, or Hezbollah is facing a quite immediate existential threat. I think these two are the red lines that evidently Iran cannot pass, and if it wants to pass it, is going to cost a huge political capital for Iran in the region.
Mr. Connelly, the same question in terms of the outside world, particularly the markets of the outside world. If they see the situation sliding into renewal of the war, or Iran taking a dramatic action like closing the strait as pressure on Lebanon or something, can the markets do anything, or will it simply be panic as usual?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll totally be panic, but I don't think that, in that short of a term, there really is much that can be done to avoid this continued upward price trajectory. If indeed Iran is committed to a ceasefire in Lebanon being part of a broader deal, which it seems like there's every reason to believe they are. I don't want to sound repetitive, but it all comes back to the strait again. I think they will use that because the continued economic pain is something that will weigh heavily on the White House, and they may perceive that is something that will then pressure President Trump to pressure Benjamin Netanyahu with. The end of May seems like a long way away at this point, but we're coming up on Memorial Day, which starts the summer driving season in the United States. And you will see gasoline and diesel as well, demand start to ramp up at that time of year, and that will only exacerbate the upward price pressure on gasoline in the United States. It will, if there is no broader resolution, it will result in gas prices rising significantly higher than they are now, and staying that way for some time, because summer is when demand is at its peak. That is something that I think is it would be incredible to think that that's a form of a pressure point hasn't been anticipated in the White House, but who knows? And it's something that I think that in Tehran they probably would only see as being to their advantage time-wise, with any attempt to use the economic leverage to push for concessions in that regard. And there's not much of a way around it so long as the strait remains closed.
Could anyone enlighten us just for a moment? What is the next physical step? What is called for in the ceasefire agreement, for want of a better term? What is supposed to happen next that's important?
So we're getting news, I think, as this discussion is unfolding, that the parties have arrived in Pakistan. I think the next step is that the U.S. Delegation, which is Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and J.D. Vance, Vice President, will be sitting down with the SCNS leader Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Araghchi in the hours to come. And I think we'll get a better sense at that point as to how these discussions may unfold. I just note that we still don't have confirmation as to what was agreed to as part of the ceasefire agreement. There have been well-sourced assertions about that we've been able to draw conclusions from, but I just think it's important to note that.
There's another point I'd like to note. You and I are both refugees from the Foreign Service. in the talks that were stopped when we attacked Iran this time a month ago, it was Witkoff and Kushner essentially by themselves. To the best of my knowledge, there was not a single professional uh, in the American delegation, whereas the Iranians, whatever else you think about them, are skilled and hard and knowledgeable on the subjects they wish to discuss. Is there any indication that this time around they might have some professional help?
No, I've not seen any indication of that. I hope that they do. There were previous rounds in Geneva that did include a much smaller set of experts than you saw in previous negotiating rounds with other administrations. But there were a couple of people that had been included that had some experience negotiating with the Iranians. But this round, the most recent round, I have not heard that to be the case. And that is deeply problematic, of course, especially when it comes to nuclear. The technical components of any sort of nuclear deal will be foundational to what can be achieved.
Okay, cheerful news. Clearly, one of the great issues here is trust between the two parties, or there is a complete lack of trust in Israel and Iran, of course. But Iran has pointed out quite correctly that both sets of negotiations were interrupted by an an Israeli attack on Iran. From sort of the Iranian viewpoint and the American viewpoint, first Arman and then Colby, uh, is the level of trust towards the other side something that can be either overcome, ameliorated, or work around? Arman.
I don't think so. It can be overcome immediately. I think they may be able to work around it, given the pain that they feel in their own way. They are feeling, receiving for the war, or experiencing for the war. But overcoming the lack of trust, I think it actually the lack of trust has gotten worse. You know, for the Iranian point of view, Iran got bombed twice throughout two series of the negotiation in the last 7 months. From the Iranian American point of view, United States gave at least a series of the chances to Iran to come to the deal during this administration, previous administration, and so on. The deal hasn't been reached. The hostility goes back to the 1979. We are talking about the two political entities for almost half a century. They were added with each other. I mean, either through the proxies or either directly, be as it, the hostage crisis, the exchange of the fire in the Persian Gulf during the years of war with Iraq, then war on terror, and so on and so on. So the trust is not going to be resolved quite time soon. And I think as long as there is a political entity such as the Islamic Republic in Iran, it wouldn't be really totally resolved ever. But what can be done is that the states are also driven by their interests and desire to survive. They are survivalist creatures. So the pain, the experience of the pain, meaning the war, and also elements of the national security might drive them to work around it. But that would be it.
Okay, we're about to run out of time, so I'm going to pass on Colby and let you get away with not answering the question. Very quickly, around on this is for each of you, please answer in 30 seconds. How soon do you think it will be before the ceasefire collapses? Infinity isn't an answer, and what will cause the collapse? Jen.
I think it depends on what your definition of a collapse of the ceasefire is. I think the president will attempt to project that this is ended because fundamentally that's in his best interest at this point. I think we will see violations of the ceasefire. And so I guess the question becomes how much can the U.S. withstand as far as those violations go before it has to admit that it is falling apart. I don't know. I give it 1 week before there is some sort of back and forth lobbed against each other again.
Arman?
Well, President Trump showed himself as a person who is willing to extend deadlines. So if the negotiation actually are going to a meaningful stage, he might extend the ceasefire, but it's not going to be a long-term one. It's going to be something very short. But if the negotiation it doesn't go as in a way that he wants, it might collapse as really much even earlier than the ceasefire itself deadline, or immediately afterwards. So it depends on the nature of the and President Trump's feeling of the negotiation.
Colby.
Well, I'll try to stay in my lane with my answer here, but I think if if the flows through the strait don't materialize, or if they're seen as insufficient by the U.S. side, or if maybe Iran is just totally unyielding on the tolling issue, something like that, I could see any of those factors being something that certainly push towards some kind of a collapse. Because if the president doesn't feel like he's getting any of the economic relief that he's looking for because of clearly how badly things can continue to deteriorate, that could certainly be an area where patience just runs out.
Well, thank you all for that optimistic note on closing this out. My guess at the moment is a week, and it will be because of an overflow of something happening in Lebanon, but I hope I'm wrong. Thank you all very much. It's been an enlightening look into the confusion. I'm not sure it has, we have made some good guesses, but it's not in our hands. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.